Calvin Coolidge was the 30th President of the United States, 1923–29. He acceded to the presidency after the death in office of Warren G. Harding, just as the Harding scandals were coming to light. He restored integrity to the executive branch of the federal government while continuing the conservative pro-business policies of his predecessor. Calvin Coolidge worked as a lawyer in Northampton, Massachusetts. A Republican, he entered politics as a city councilman in Northampton in 1898 and served in the Massachusetts state government before being elected governor in 1918. He was U.S. Vice President under Warren G. Harding and assumed the presidency upon Harding's death. Coolidge acceded to the presidency after the death in office of Warren G. Harding, just as the Harding scandals were coming to light. He restored integrity to the executive branch of the federal government while continuing the conservative pro-business policies of his predecessor. A Republican, Coolidge entered politics as a city councilman in Northampton, Massachusetts, in 1898. He was elected mayor of Northampton in 1909 and then served in the Massachusetts state government as senator, 1911–15, and lieutenant governor, 1915–18. Elected governor in 1918, Coolidge captured national attention the following year when he called out the state guard to quell violence and disorder resulting from a strike by the Boston police, who had formed a labor union to press their demands for better pay and working conditions. When labor leaders called on him to support their demands for reinstatement of police officers who had been fired for striking, Coolidge refused, summing up his reasoning in a single sentence that reverberated throughout the country: "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." That statement, combined with Coolidge's strong stand against the Boston police at a time when many Americans viewed organized labor as too radical, catapulted Coolidge onto the Republican Party's ticket in 1920 as Harding's vice presidential running mate. The personality of the taciturn Coolidge could not have provided a greater contrast to that of the gregarious Harding. In terms of policy, however, Harding and Coolidge were nearly identical. Both were members of the Old Guard Republicans, that conservative segment of the party that had remained with Pres. William Howard Taft in the 1912 election when Theodore Roosevelt left to form the Bull Moose Party. Promising the American people a return to normalcy, Harding and Coolidge achieved the greatest popular vote margin in presidential elections to that time, crushing the Democratic ticket of James Cox and Franklin Delano Roosevelt by 60 to 34%. The electoral vote was equally one-sided, 404 to 127. Calvin Coolidge, 30th President of the United States, is an understudied president whose achievements warrant greater consideration. Coolidge's appreciation of civility, traditional federalism, individual initiative, political bipartisanship, and common sense stand out in today's rough political environment. Providence, the rule of law and values of our forefathers all guided Coolidge throughout his life. Coolidge was born on July 4, 1872, the only president to share a birthday with the country. Growing up in the Vermont hamlet of Plymouth Notch, the boy watched as his father, John Coolidge, and grandfather Calvin Galusha Coolidge, made their living in rocky Vermont through a variety of trades. Coolidge also learned the importance of local government by attending town meetings and observing his father's service as town sheriff or selectman. Additionally, the family ran the town post office. After graduating from Amherst College, Coolidge read law at a firm, Hammond and Field, in Northampton, Massachusetts, and worked his way up the ladder of the Bay State's politics, eventually becoming governor of the state. While governor, Coolidge made a tough decision. He backed up his police commissioner in the firing of Boston policemen who had broken their contract by walking off the job to strike. Riots ensued, and Coolidge called in the National Guard, declaring there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. Coolidge's actions brought peace to Boston and elevated Coolidge to the national spotlight. Soon after, the Republican Party named the Bay State governor to the second spot on the 1920 Republican presidential ticket. The Republican platform called for a reduction in high taxes, a legacy of World War I, as well as government cutbacks. The pair advocated, After the tumult of the war and the influenza pandemic, a return to what the presidential candidate, Senator Warren Harding of Ohio, termed normalcy. The sudden death of President Harding in 1923 found the Coolidges in Vermont on vacation. As presidential inaugurations go, Coolidge's was therefore most unusual. Coolidge's father John, a notary public, swore him in by kerosene light. As president, Coolidge vowed to pursue the policy aims to which his party had committed to perfection. The new president devoted himself to both tax and budget cuts, with the White House going so far as to dub twin lion cubs received as a gift budget bureau and tax reduction. The 1920s economy thrived, and Coolidge was resoundingly elected in 1924, taking more votes than the other two parties combined. In good measure because he achieved the goals that he set for himself and the country, the federal government actually shrank under Coolidge. Coolidge became even more popular in his second term, so Americans expected that he would run again in 1928. Coolidge, however, demurred and later wrote in his autobiography that it was better for the country to change leadership from time to time. At every stage, Calvin Coolidge's wife, Grace Anna Goodhue, aided him. Grace, who had trained as an instructor of the deaf, was as vivacious as her husband was solemn. She shared his love of their home state, and carried its down-to-earth spirit with her throughout their 28-year marriage. Both his dry Yankee wit and his frugality with words made Coolidge legendary, earning him the nickname Silent Cal. But that doesn't mean he didn't speak when he felt like it, as the volumes of Coolidge press conferences attest. He was concerned about all Americans, especially working-class men and women. He wanted them to be free, independent, and self-reliant. Like Jefferson, he wanted every American to be able to rise as far as their abilities permitted. The people see in him one of their own. The powerful turn to him because he is an intellectual aristocrat and the weak because he is also a plain farmer. He is one of them all. R.M. Washburn, Calvin Coolidge, his first biography, 100. President Coolidge never sought to make history for himself. He wished for Americans to be independent of government, which is why the Coolidge Foundation itself does not accept federal funds. In recent decades, his Constitution-based principles of government, deep-rooted integrity, and achievements in the White House have provoked renewed interest and praise from former presidents and ordinary citizens alike. During the 1890s and early 1900s, Coolidge efficiently rose through the ranks of the local and state Republican Party, serving on Northampton's council, as city solicitor, as clerk of courts for Hampshire County, and as a representative in the Massachusetts House and State Senate. Extraordinarily reserved for a politician, he won respect for his thoroughness, diligence, and fair-mindedness. He served as mayor of Northampton and in 1915 was elected lieutenant governor. A conservative Republican who believed in limited government and reduction of debt, Coolidge broke with some in his party and came out in favor of women's suffrage. In 1918 he was elected governor and supported some mildly progressive measures. He achieved national fame during the 1919 Boston police officers' strike with his assertion, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anyone, anywhere, anytime." In the turbulent atmosphere of post-World War I America, many saw Coolidge as a symbol of law and order, and his stance during the strike contributed to his surprise selection by the Republican National Convention for vice president in 1920. As vice president to President Warren G. Harding, Coolidge had little to do aside from presiding over the Senate, although the gracious Harding invited him to regularly attend cabinet meetings. The Coolidges kept an $8 a day suite in the Willard Hotel and dined out often. When asked why they attended so many social functions, Calvin Coolidge replied, "Got to eat somewhere." Within Washington, amusing stories soon arose about the vice president's withdrawn nature. Perhaps the most famous concerned a society matron who told Coolidge at a dinner party, "Mr. Vice President, I made a bet with my friends that I could get you to say at least 3 words this evening." Coolidge fixed a steely glare on her and said, "You lose." Alice Roosevelt Longworth observed of Coolidge, when he wished he were elsewhere, he pursed his lips, folded his arms, and said nothing. He looked then precisely as though he had been weaned on a pickle. Yet comedian Will Rogers noted that Coolidge had more subtle humor than almost any public man I ever met. The vice president was in Vermont visiting his father, far from telephones and electricity, when he received a telegram in the early morning of August 3, 1923, announcing President Harding's sudden death in San Francisco. As notary public was one of many local offices held by the elder Coolidge, the new president was able to promptly take the oath of office in his father's parlor at 2:47 a.m. by light of a kerosene lamp. He returned to Washington the following day. No two political figures could have been less alike than Coolidge and Harding. Yet Coolidge found in this an opportunity for a change in the tone of the presidency. Sensing the country wanted a breath of fresh air after the grandiloquent Harding years, Coolidge allowed his naturally quiet, thoughtful nature to be embellished into a persona of a leader who said and did no more than he had to. The words of a president have an enormous weight, he wrote in his autobiography, and ought not to be used indiscriminately. Through regular press conferences, photographs, and appearances on the radio and in talking motion pictures, Coolidge shrewdly cultivated a public image of a reticent, prudent Vermonter, and his reputation for integrity overwhelmed opponents' attempts to tie him to the emerging scandals that followed the Harding administration. In 1924, Coolidge sought re-election with the slogan "Keep Cool with Coolidge" and won a tremendous victory with 54% of the vote in a three-way race, carrying 35 of the 48 states. Yet, whatever enjoyment Coolidge might have derived from winning a full term of his own was dissolved by the untimely death of his son Calvin Jr. on July 7, 1924. The 16-year-old died of blood poisoning, which developed from a blister on his foot, the result of playing tennis without socks. Coolidge wrote, "In his suffering he was asking me to make him well. I could not." The father, devastated, continued, "When he went the power and the glory of the presidency went with him." Coolidge believed that business and government should remain as separate as possible from one another, with each in its own sphere, free of interference. His belief in limited, frugal government led him to veto legislation for farm relief and for development of electric water power in the Tennessee River Valley. His policies, marked by tax cuts, reductions in federal spending and minimal government regulation of private industry, banking, and stock trading, were identified in the public mind with the remarkable, though unevenly distributed, economic prosperity of the 1920s. It spurred the tremendous growth of consumer products, especially automobiles and radios, thus significantly increasing mobility and access to developing news for many American families, especially those in rural areas. President Coolidge signed the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, and his Interior Department authorized the Brookings Institution to conduct exhaustive surveys of federal programs for Native Americans. Like Harding, he encouraged vigorous federal efforts to end lynching and backed U.S. membership in the World Court. Coolidge also favored Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg's plans to prohibit the use of war as an instrument of national policy, which resulted in the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. That same year Coolidge visited Havana and addressed a Pan-American Conference of Western Hemisphere leaders. Issues with Mexico, Nicaragua, and China were mainly entrusted by Coolidge to his Secretary of State and diplomatic personnel. While vacationing in South Dakota's Black Hills in August 1927, Coolidge told the press, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. During this 2-month Western trip, Coolidge received and accepted an invitation to dedicate the Mount Rushmore National Memorial. Over the next 14 years sculptor Gutzon Borglum directed the carvings of the likenesses of Presidents George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. In March 1929, Coolidge left the White House to his successor Herbert Hoover and returned to Northampton for retirement. Coolidge busied himself with writing magazine articles, a regular newspaper column, and his autobiography. Even as the stock market crash of October 1929 led to a worldwide depression, Coolidge remained so popular that some Republicans wished to nominate him instead of Herbert Hoover in 1932. Coolidge, however, knew that his days in public life were over, as he put it, We are in a new era to which I do not belong, and it would not be possible for me to adjust to it." Less than a month later, on January 5, 1933, he died of a heart attack at age 60. During the Coolidge administration, the most conspicuous change to the White House was the replacement of the surviving 1,817 attic with a full third floor. President Coolidge, when told of the structural difficulties of the attic, asked that if it was in such crisis, why doesn't it fall down? In 1927, William Adams Delano of the New York firm of Delano Aldrich was called upon for design advice. After studying James Hoban's 1793 drawing, Delano increased the pitch of the roof and lowered the floor to accommodate new guest and service rooms beneath a new steel and concrete roof structure. At Mrs. Coolidge's request, a rooftop sunroom facing south toward the river was added. The Sky Parlor, as it was originally called after attic rooms in old Virginia houses, has descended through time as the solarium. The Coolidge's third floor survived President Harry Truman's 1948-1952 renovation of the house. Grace Coolidge, keenly interested in history and disappointed to find few original furnishings on her arrival at the White House, began to study old photographs of the state floor. In 1925, the First Lady obtained a congressional resolution for the acceptance of treasured objects as gifts to a permanent White House collection and secured the assistance of an advisory committee of experts to evaluate and make recommendations on the decor of staterooms and to review the offers of gifts. Plans were proposed by the committee to refurnish the green and red rooms in a colonial revival style, but the proposals created so much public controversy that President Coolidge spiked them. Mrs. Coolidge crocheted a coverlet for the Lincoln bed with the intent of starting a tradition where each First Lady would leave a memento of life in the White House. The Coolidges celebrated their first Christmas in the White House in 1923 quietly, with their sons Calvin Jr. and John, who were both home from Missisburg Academy in Pennsylvania. At 5 p.m. on Christmas Eve, the President pressed a button and lighted strings of more than 2,500 electric bulbs on the National Christmas tree, a 60-foot-tall fir from his native Vermont given by Middlebury College, on the ellipse. More than 6,000 people then arrived on the White House grounds at the Coolidge's invitation to sing Christmas carols with the choir of the First Congregational Church, and enjoy the music of the U.S. Marine Band. President Coolidge became the first chief executive to preside over a public celebration of the Christmas holidays. Since 1954, the Christmas Pageant of Peace has been held annually on the ellipse and includes the lighting of the national Christmas tree and respects the holiday worship of all faiths. Mrs. Coolidge spent Christmas Day in 1923 helping the Salvation Army distribute food baskets. After Christmas dinner, the entire Coolidge family went to Walter Reed Hospital where they joined several hundred disabled veterans for a preview of the motion picture Abraham Lincoln produced by Al and Ray Rocket. For the Coolidges, their sorrowful Christmas of 1924 was preoccupied with memories of their younger son Calvin Jr. Despite the tragedy, the Coolidges maintained the ceremonial lighting of the National Community Christmas tree followed by a performance by the President's First Congregational Church Choir singing carols at the White House. The First Lady continued her support of the Salvation Army and the Union mission by distributing food baskets and toys to families in need. Throughout the Coolidge administration, Christmas celebrations were a mix of traditional family gatherings and the new community-centered public ceremony symbolized by the lighting of the national Christmas tree. Thank you for watching this video.